All right, government class, today we're going to start talking about the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Remember, we talked about that the Constitution was written as a framework for government, and in that, they allowed for the Constitution to be changed or amended. And the Bill of Rights, or the first 10 amendments, came very quickly after the Constitution was created. So, why did that happen? The founding fathers, of course, were very worried about big government. And while the Constitution laid out a framework of checks and balances and how many representatives each state would get, they still wanted to make sure that the government could not take away certain things. So the Bill of Rights guarantees certain freedoms and that the government cannot do certain things. You've probably heard a lot of these. It was also based off of or modeled after the English Bill of Rights. Remember, nothing's created in a vacuum. Just like the Founding Fathers looked to John Locke when writing the Declaration of Independence, they're going to look to England when creating the Bill of Rights. So there is an English Bill of Rights that it was modeled after. So let's look at what the 10 are, and then we'll go into each one of them specifically. So Amendment 1 is often called the freedoms because it's the one that lists all those freedoms that you're familiar with: freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, petition the government. Second is right to bear arms. Third is no quartering of troops. 4 is unreasonable search and seizure. 5 is due process, double jeopardy, and self-incrimination. 6 is speedy trial. 7 is a trial by jury of peers. 8 is excessive bail or cruel and unusual punishment. And then 9, not all the rights are here, but they're retained by the people. And then number 10 is powers goes back to the states. So that's a very quick overview, and we'll go and look at each of these individually. So let's look at Amendment number 1. Amendment number 1 is probably the most famous amendment. It's the one that lists out those 5 specific freedoms that you have. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech, press, or the right of the people to peacefully to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So there's 5, right? So 1 for every finger on your hand. If you can't tick off each one on your finger, then you've missed one, right? So make sure that you know your 5 basic rights guaranteed in the First Amendment: religion, speech, press, assemble, and petition the government. Let's take a look at this first freedom. The Bill of Rights, that very first thing that they absolutely wanted to make sure that the government could not take away from you. What did they think first and foremost? Religion. In that, we get 2 things, or let's talk about 3 things. We're going to have the Establishment Clause, the Free Exercise Clause, and then separation of church and state. So it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. So what does that mean? Think about why a lot of the people came to the New World when they were leaving England and setting up the colonies. They wanted freedom to worship and to lead the lives that they wanted separate from the religion of England. Because in England there was a Church of England, and it was very rigid, and you had to be a part of the Church of England. It was a state-run religion, and people didn't want to do that. Think about all the Puritans and the separatists that ended up in New England. So the very first thing they want to make sure is that the government will not create a church-run religion. So no matter what you want, there's not going to be a Church of America. That's really straightforward. Now, the Free Exercise Clause, which says, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This is how you practice your religion. They wanted to make sure that the government didn't come in and say, can't do this, you have to do that. They didn't want the government, maybe it wasn't a state-run religion, but the government was interfering with how you practiced your religion. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because we have a lot of religions in the United States now. There's a lot of different things that people believe. So how do we not interfere with how people practice their religion? So let's take, for example, let's say you decide, my religion requires human sacrifice. No, don't think that's gonna work. There is a litmus test. You can't be breaking laws. You can't be going around killing people saying, oh, I killed this person in the name of my religion. That's not gonna pass the muster. But what about things like polygamy? Some religions believe in having many wives. If we tell that person that they can't have a lot of wives, is that interfering with their exercise of religion? What about something like facial hair? Muslim religions require that males have facial hair. What if they go to prison and the prison requires them to shave it? Is that interfering with their free exercise of their religion? What about all these new health care laws that are coming out with Obamacare and the Affordable Health Care Act that require you to provide health insurance that includes abortions? What if your religion doesn't believe in abortion, so you're forcing them to sponsor something that goes against their religion? What about serving certain groups of people, like gay people or African Americans in the 60s? What if your religion states that you don't believe in those certain things? So you can see, this is where we get into this idea of strict versus loose interpretation. How you can interpret something very strictly and by exactly what it says, letter of the law, or you can look at it more broadly. And that's where a lot of these things are going to be interpreted. The Bill of Rights gets interpreted, especially through the Supreme Court. So those two parts of the First Amendment give us the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, really guaranteeing you a protection for religion. The other thing that often gets talked about is separation of church and state. Students often think that separation of church and state actually appears in the Constitution, but it doesn't. And never in the Constitution or in the amendments does it state separation of church and state. It comes from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to a Baptist association when they asked him, well, why don't you set up holidays, of Christian holidays? And he wrote that there should be a clear line between separating the church and the government, or church and the state. And so that's where we get that phrase from. And a lot of times it comes up during things like when we talk about prayer in school, because schools are a government institution. They're run by the government. So if the school is requiring that there be a prayer at the beginning and is leading prayer, is that overstepping that line and that's separating church and state? But again, here's that loose interpretation versus strict interpretation, because what about money? You've got "In God We Trust" written on our currency. You've got the president putting his hand on a Bible and pledging to protect the nation. So help me God. You've got our Pledge of Allegiance, one nation under God. So that's all wrapped up in the First Amendment's freedom of religion. The second freedom guaranteed in the First Amendment is speech. Okay, we all know that we have the right to speak our minds. That's very American, right? Being able to say what you want. But what about hate speech? Is that protected? What about profanity, especially on things like TV and in movies and on records? Can I go into a building and just scream "fire, fire" if there's no fire? So is all speech protected? Things to think about. Freedom of the press. So freedom of the press comes from the way printing press, right? They would put paper down and they use a printing press to disseminate information. And they wanted to make sure that the government could not come in and shut down newspapers and shut down people's way of getting information. Now, most people don't get their information from a printed pamphlet anymore. Most of the time it's going to be from things like the internet or the TV, like CNN and Fox News. But if you watch CNN or Fox News, you can tell that there's a lot of freedom there, right? They can criticize the government, they can have dissenting opinions, and the government's not going to come in and pull the plug just because they said, oh, I don't like Obama or I don't like Bush. So there's a great deal of freedom of the press, again, guaranteed in that First Amendment. Freedom to assemble. Large crowds protesting can be scary, right? And governments often sometimes, worry about large groups of people, against the government or causing havoc. But the Founding Fathers realized that that's an essential part. If the government can't just come in and prohibit people from getting together and to show either their pleasure or their displeasure. We have the right to peacefully assemble. And then lastly, to petition the government. If you think that the government is wrong, you have the right to petition them for a redress of grievances. Think about women and getting the right to vote. They petitioned the government saying, you know what, we have we're people and we need the right to vote. So that is all wrapped up in the First Amendment. So make sure that you know your First Amendment rights. But what about all these others? So let's look very quickly, and you'll look at each of these more in depth in your lesson. But let's look at some of the controversies and some of the things and how relevant these amendments are right now. So let's look at Amendment number 2, the right to bear arms. You have the right to buy a gun. It's a constitutional amendment. It's a constitutional right. Your ability to own a gun. There's a lot of controversy right now on how can you restrict that. Can we put up barriers to prevent guns from getting into the wrong hands? When the Founding Fathers did this, were they thinking about guns getting into, the hands of madmen? Can we put background checks and keep certain Americans from getting guns? Or does that go against your Second Amendment? Quartering of troops. Let's say we go to war and we run out of money. Government can't ask me to house troops, right? That goes back to the colonists when they were asked by England to quarter troops. It was part of the Intolerable Acts and all those taxes that started the revolution to begin with. If you've ever watched any kind of crime drama, you know about unreasonable search and seizure. The government cannot just bust up in your house and take your property, right? And it can't just look for evidence. It has to have that search warrant, unreasonable search and seizure. Number 5 is your right to due process. The government can't just come in, take you, and then accuse you of crimes, and then try you, find you not guilty, and then pull you in again and try you for the same crime. That's called double jeopardy. Self-incrimination. You are required, you can have a lawyer. That's when all those, on the crime dramas, when they have people reading you your rights so that you know that you have the right to be silent. You don't have to incriminate yourself. Speedy trials. This, again, goes back to England. They would be thrown into the Tower of London, and they might sit there for 20, 30 years and never see a trial. Okay? You can't just arrest someone and then forget about them. Okay? You have the right to a trial, and it should be within a time frame. You can't just rot in jail and die there and be like, oops, forgot to try you. Trial by a jury of peers. We in America pride ourselves on justice, and part of that justice process is being tried by a jury, right? The evidence is presented, people weigh it, and it's not just one person saying, nope, guilty, I don't like what you did. It's by a jury of your peers. Excessive bail. Oh, we're going to hold you and you have to pay $2 million and you're never going to get out because you can never pay it. Again, going back to the Tower of London, and someone didn't pay, the back taxes of $20 and they throw them in jail and they owe, so you can't get out without paying like $500. Cruel or unusual punishment. This is that the punishment should meet the crime, right? You steal some bread and then you're thrown in jail and never see the light of day. Does that punishment meet the crime? This also goes to when you are looking at things like the death penalty. Some people use this as an argument against the death penalty. So if you're writing your paper on that, you'll use the 8th Amendment a lot. Amendment 9. Now here's an interesting amendment, because Amendment 9 says not all rights are listed. That we know that looking into the future, 20, 30, 40 years from now, there's going to be rights that we can't foresee. So we want to say that there are rights that are still protected. Most of this has to do with like rights to privacy, because if you'll notice in the Bill of Rights, it never lists privacy as a right, but it's just sort of been assumed that 9 is one of those rights that the Founding Fathers didn't foresee, the need for privacy. And now, of course, that extends into things like the internet. So they wanted, again, just like they made the Constitution flexible and able to be amended, they didn't want it to be just like, oh, these are your rights. Anything outside of that, the government can take away. It's not listed. No, they said, no, we know that there are rights that exist and that things can be protected and things are going to come up. And we want people to have all of these rights. So they added Amendment number 9. Founding Fathers are pretty clever that way. They didn't want to be boxed in, right? Now, again, remember, this is coming very close after the writing of the Constitution, and they still firmly believed in states' rights, where the states held more power. They didn't want a strong federal government. They're like conceding that they needed a strong federal government, but they didn't want a huge, overpowering government. So they put in powers go back to the states. If the powers are not listed here and it can't be determined that the federal government has it, who holds that power? The states hold that power. So that's important too. So those are your Bill of Rights. We've looked at how they can be interpreted. We've looked very particularly at Amendment 1 and gone through briefly the verse 10. And we'll take a look at the rest in the next lesson.